The year 1947 was a time of great change for the Indian subcontinent. After nearly 2 centuries of rule, the British Empire was preparing to leave. This departure was a moment of immense hope, a dream of freedom that many had fought and died for. However, this dream of a single independent India was not shared by everyone. The British decided that when they left, they would not leave behind one country, but 2. This decision, known as the Partition of India, led to the creation of a new nation called Pakistan alongside the newly independent India. The idea was to create a separate homeland for the large Muslim population of the subcontinent, while India would be a secular state with a Hindu majority. This division was meant to solve a political problem, but it set the stage for one of the greatest human tragedies of the 20th century. The reasons for this division were complex and had been growing for many decades. Religion played a very significant role. While Hindus and Muslims had lived alongside each other for centuries, political tensions in the early 20th century began to drive a wedge between the communities. Some Muslim leaders grew worried that in an independent united India, where Hindus were the majority, the rights and culture of Muslims would not be protected. The Muslim League, a political party led by Muhammad Ali Jinnah, began to strongly advocate for a separate nation. They argued that Muslims were not just a minority group, but a distinct nation that deserved its own state. This powerful idea, known as the two-nation theory, gained more and more support among Muslims who feared for their future in a Hindu-dominated country. On the other side of this debate was the Indian National Congress, the largest political party fighting for independence. Its most prominent leaders, including Mahatma Gandhi and Jawaharlal Nehru, fiercely opposed the idea of dividing India. They believed in a united, secular country where people of all religions could live together as equal citizens. They felt that dividing the country along religious lines was a terrible mistake that would betray the very idea of a unified Indian identity. However, the political landscape was incredibly tense. Years of negotiations, political disagreements, and growing mistrust between the Congress and the Muslim League made finding a compromise almost impossible. The British, eager to leave India after the Second World War, ultimately accepted the demand for partition as the quickest way to transfer power. The key leaders of this era held deeply opposing views that shaped the final outcome. Muhammad Ali Jinnah was unwavering in his demand for Pakistan. He believed it was the only way to guarantee political, economic, and religious security for the subcontinent's Muslims. Jawaharlal Nehru, who would become India's first Prime Minister, championed the vision of a modern, secular, and united India. He saw partition as a failure of that vision, but eventually accepted it as an unavoidable political reality. Mahatma Gandhi, often called the father of the nation, was heartbroken by the division. He had worked his entire life for a free and united India and saw the partition as a deep personal and national tragedy. Despite his immense influence, he was unable to stop the political forces that were pushing the country towards its eventual split. The official date for the end of British rule and the birth of India and Pakistan was set for August 15, 1947. To create the new countries, the British had to divide the subcontinent, which meant drawing new borders. This enormous task was given to a British lawyer named Sir Cyril Radcliffe. He had never been to India before and was given only 5 weeks to draw the lines that would separate the two new nations. The new borders, known as the Radcliffe Line, were drawn through the large provinces of Punjab in the west and Bengal in the east. These provinces had large mixed populations of Hindus, Muslims, and Sikhs, and dividing them was an incredibly difficult and sensitive task. The line was drawn based on maps and census data, often cutting right through villages, farms, and even houses. The process of drawing these borders was done in secret. The people living in Punjab and Bengal had no idea where the new line would be drawn. They did not know whether their village would end up in India or in Pakistan. This uncertainty created immense fear and anxiety. Families who had lived on their land for generations suddenly faced the terrifying possibility of becoming foreigners in their own homes. The final borders were only announced on August 17, 1947, 2 days after independence had already been declared. This delay meant that when the celebrations of freedom were happening in the cities of Delhi and Karachi, millions of people in the border regions were still in the dark about their fate, adding to the confusion and chaos that was about to unfold. The logic behind the Radcliffe Line was to separate Muslim majority areas from non-Muslim majority areas. However, the population was so intermingled that drawing a clean line was impossible. In Punjab, the Sikh community was particularly devastated. Their historic homeland was split in two, with their holiest shrines, including Nankana Sahib, the birthplace of their founder Guru Nanak, ending up in Pakistan. In Bengal, the division created an eastern wing of Pakistan that was geographically separated from its western wing by over 1,000 miles of Indian territory. This awkward geographical split would later lead to its own conflict and the creation of Bangladesh in 1971. The drawing of the line was a cold administrative act that failed to consider the deep cultural and human connections that it was severing. The decision to partition British India and the way the borders were drawn set the stage for unimaginable suffering. The new nations of India and Pakistan were born into a storm of violence and displacement. The hope of independence was quickly overshadowed by the horror of what was happening to ordinary people on the ground. The line drawn on a map by a man who barely knew the country became a river of blood, separating families and communities forever. It was a political solution that created a human catastrophe, a decision whose consequences were felt not just in 1947 but continue to echo through the subcontinent to this day, shaping the relationship between the two nations and the lives of millions. The announcement of the new borders triggered one of the largest and most violent migrations in human history. With the lines now drawn, millions of people found themselves on the wrong side. Hindus and Sikhs living in the areas that were now part of Pakistan began to fear for their safety. Similarly, Muslims living in what was now India felt vulnerable and unsafe. This mutual fear, fueled by rumors and political rhetoric, erupted into widespread violence. Mobs, driven by religious hatred and a desire for revenge, attacked people from the other community. Entire villages were burned down, and trains carrying refugees from one side to the other were ambushed and attacked. The joy of independence was completely drowned out by the cries of pain and loss. In a desperate attempt to reach safety, an estimated 15 million people left their ancestral homes and walked towards the new borders. Hindus and Sikhs traveled from Pakistan to India, while Muslims traveled from India to Pakistan. They traveled on foot, in bullock carts, and on dangerously overcrowded trains. These long journeys were filled with peril. Many died from starvation, disease, and exhaustion. Countless others were killed in violent attacks along the way. Families were torn apart in the chaos, with children separated from their parents and spouses losing each other forever. The stories from this period are filled with unimaginable horror of people who lost everything: their homes, their land, their possessions, and their loved ones. The scale of the human tragedy was staggering. Historians estimate that between 1 and 2 million people were killed in the violence that accompanied the partition. Women in particular suffered horrific violence. Tens of thousands were abducted, assaulted, and brutalized by men from the opposing community. The violence was not just random. It was a systematic attempt to terrorize people and force them to flee. The very fabric of society, where different communities had coexisted for centuries, was ripped apart in a matter of months. Neighborhoods where Hindus, Muslims, and Sikhs had been friends and neighbors became battlegrounds. The trust that had bound them together was replaced by deep-seated hatred and suspicion. The hope that had filled the air on the eve of independence quickly turned into sorrow and despair. For the millions who survived the journey, life was incredibly difficult. They arrived in their new countries as refugees with nothing but the clothes on their backs. They had to start their lives over from scratch, often in crowded and unsanitary refugee camps. The governments of the newly formed India and Pakistan were completely overwhelmed and struggled to provide food, shelter, and security for the millions of displaced people. The trauma of partition left deep scars on the minds of those who lived through it. The memories of the violence and loss were passed down through generations, shaping the identity of millions and forever changing the social landscape of the subcontinent. The partition of 1947 was not an event that ended once the borders were drawn and the refugees settled. Its consequences have continued to shape the history, politics, and identity of both India and Pakistan for over 75 years. The division created a legacy of bitterness and hostility between the two nations that has never fully healed. Since their independence, India and Pakistan have fought several wars, many of them over the disputed territory of Kashmir, a region whose fate was left undecided during the partition. This ongoing conflict has meant that both countries spend huge amounts of money on their militaries, resources that could otherwise be used for the development and well-being of their people. The relationship remains tense, marked by deep mistrust and frequent political crises. The impact of partition is also deeply felt within the societies of both countries. The memory of the violence created a strong sense of religious identity that continues to influence politics today. In both nations, the other community is often viewed with suspicion, and political leaders have sometimes used the memory of partition to stir up religious nationalism for their own gain. The stories of suffering and survival have become a core part of the national identity on both sides of the border. These stories are told in books, films, and family histories, ensuring that the trauma of 1947 is never forgotten. For millions, their identity is defined not just by their nationality, but by their family's experience as refugees who survived the Great Divide. However, the legacy is not only one of conflict. There is also a shared culture and history that the border cannot erase. People in both India and Pakistan share similar languages, food, music, and traditions. Families that were split by the partition still maintain connections across the border, a quiet reminder of their common heritage. In recent years, there have been growing movements among younger generations on both sides who wish to build bridges and move beyond the politics of hatred. They use social media and cultural exchanges to connect with one another, discovering their shared humanity and challenging the narratives of division that they have inherited from the past. These efforts represent a small but important glimmer of hope for a more peaceful future. Ultimately, the partition of India stands as a profound lesson in how political decisions, made in haste, can have devastating and long-lasting human consequences. It was a moment that brought both the triumph of freedom from colonial rule and the tragedy of a land and its people being torn apart. Today, as we look back from 2025, the wound of partition remains unhealed. The border that Sir Cyril Radcliffe drew on a map continues to be a line of conflict, but it is also a place where shared memories and hopes for reconciliation survive. The story of partition is a reminder of the fragility of peace and the terrible cost of dividing people based on their differences, a story that continues to unfold every single day in the lives of millions across South Asia.